being rooted in principle, being seen as having a high level of integrity and credibility is a very important element in having influence, exerting influence, and ultimately persuading people.
Welcome to another episode of Chief Influencer. I'm your host, Anthony Shop, co-founder of Social Driver. Let's face it, Washington is the center of influence in the US and arguably in the world. Chief Influencer features leaders who have figured out how to break through in today's fragmented and fast-changing environment. Social Driver teamed up with the Communications Board and the George Washington University College of Professional Studies to recognize these incredible leaders as chief influencers and highlight how they inspire and influence others. I'm thrilled to introduce today's guest, Peter Goettler, President and CEO of the Cato Institute. And Peter has spent the last decade leading one of Washington's most influential champions of the moral case for liberty at Cato. So here are a few things I think you should know about him before we dive into today's conversation. First, Peter believes principled leadership matters. Under his leadership, Cato has continued to make the case for individual liberty, limited government, free markets, and peace, not just as policy preferences, but really as enduring principles that should guide public life. And principled leadership, I know, is going to be a big theme for us today. Second, Peter brings an unusual combination of financial and institutional leadership to the world of ideas. Before joining Cato, he spent more than 2 decades on Wall Street in senior leadership roles, and now applies that strategic discipline to one of the country's leading think tanks, which is a think tank, but we'll hear much more. And finally, he's focused on more than just today's political fights. Peter has helped position Cato as an independent force in the battle of ideas, committed to free speech, open inquiry, and preparing future generations to carry the torch of liberty. So, Peter, you've been called many things: a Wall Street leader, a steward of one of Washington's most influential think tanks, and a champion of the moral case for liberty. Today, we're thrilled to call you a chief influencer.
All right.
Welcome.
Anthony, thanks so much. It's a real pleasure being with you.
Absolutely. Well, I walk by your office a lot. I have been familiar with the organization since way back in college. And so I think it's going to be fun to sort of go under the hood a little bit and
Sure.
hear how
We
an
can get as far
organization-
under the hood as you want.
Yeah, I mean, because the way that we get our message out when it comes to research and policy, and these things, in some ways it stayed the same, but of course, in some ways it's changed a lot.
Sure.
And for people who, know the Cato Institute by name, but just may not fully understand it or what you do, how do you describe what Cato is and the role that it plays in American public life today?
Well, Anthony, you teed that up pretty well because, we view ourselves as being one of the, most important, wholly consistent voices for liberty in the nation's capital. A think tank, just for members of the audience who need a refresher, is a public policy research organization. It's doing, research, analysis, writing in order to try to influence the direction of public policy in the nation. And for Washington-based think tanks, federal policy is very important. At Cato, we're a little bit different. A lot of think tanks, even though they all say they're nonpartisan, because they're 501c3s and they have to be nonpartisan organizations, most of them line up either with the red team or the blue team. They tend to be partisan or political to one extent, from one extent to another. And for us, we're really guided by an underlying philosophy of libertarianism. It's a word that we don't like. It's not necessarily the best marketing word, but it is useful as a label. And for us, we view ourselves as, advocating for a high degree of freedom in the economic realm. We don't want a lot of government intervention and interference in economic matters, but we also advocate for a very high degree of freedom in our personal lives. So we care a lot about people being able to live their lives as they see fit. We care a lot about the criminal justice system has to work properly, because if it's not, innocent people may be losing their freedom and being locked up. We care a lot about civil liberties and being able to speak our minds. So that's really the kind of our philosophy in a nutshell, and that guides everything that we do. We have a statement of principles that people can see on our website. It's a summary of what we believe, and from time to time we may change the way we articulate those principles, but the principles themselves, will never change. Cato has existed for almost 50 years now. It was founded in, 1977. And I think it's fair to say that, the principles that underlie the institution and our work, haven't changed at all during that time. And as a result, our position on, important matters of public policy, or really any matters of public policy, haven't changed during that time as well. Even while, we've seen conservatives and progressives evolve in ways that over the last 50 years, they've even switched positions on some issues. The last thing I would say is, and this is another thing that you foreshadowed in your introduction, we view our role as, not just, engaging in policy, even though that's an important part of our core mission, is trying to move public policy in the direction of more liberty. But we also view Cato as, an important institution in keeping the ideas of liberty alive, for our country, passing the ideas and principles of liberty, the principles that are, enshrined in our statement, on to future generations. So we're not just engaging with policymakers, we're engaging with the public, we're engaging with educators, we're engaging with students and young people.
Yeah, and that's something I want to get into a little bit later,
Mm-hmm.
because it's something that I think differentiates Cato from other think tanks in terms of the work that you do, with educators and with young people. But to go to
One thing I'll say
go ahead.
is you asked, what would people maybe not know about Cato?
Mhm.
I should say that the most common misperception is that we're part of the right. And I think where that comes from is historically conservatives have kind of lined up with libertarians in economic matters, both supportive of free markets. And that's something that hasn't changed for us, but it seems to have changed quite a bit on the right. And I will say, I won't speak for all of my colleagues, but for me, I don't feel a gravitational pull towards, one political tribe or the other. For me, it's all about the principles, and I align with Democrats on many issues and have many areas of disagreement with them, and I align with Republicans on many issues as well, and also have areas of disagreement. So often we're seen as part of the right, but we believe that that's a misperception.
So you've said, that Cato is grounded in principle rather than one party, or either party. And I guess, what does that mean in practice when both sides of the political spectrum, as you sort of alluded to, have moved in ways that, they change positions, and they're frankly moving in ways that you all don't agree with, that don't align with your principles. But then in some cases, you might have opportunities to partner with groups on either, or not necessarily partner, but to, collaborate in some ways, because
Sure.
they may align with you, like on criminal justice or some specific policy. So talk about what that looks like.
I view it as having common ground with everybody. We have a conference every summer for teachers, and one of the things I say to the teachers is I could go out right here on Massachusetts Avenue or 10th Street, where we're based, and I could pull someone off the street, and I would probably agree with them on, let's say half of the issues roughly. And which half is going to depend upon where they line up on the political spectrum. And I view our work as very much one of having common ground with everybody, trying to work together to advance policy on the basis of that common ground. It's interesting that since a lot of libertarians pride themselves on being principled, in my experience, particularly looking at this world from the outside, as I did for many, many years before I worked at Cato and came to Washington, it always seemed to me that libertarians were trying to always make an excuse for why someone wasn't principled enough to engage with, that there was this area of disagreement or that area of disagreement. And my philosophy is, I want to be friends with everybody. That doesn't mean that I'm going to pretend I agree with them on everything. I'm never going to surrender, deeply held beliefs or matters of principle. But I think it's a very glass half full way to look at the world, to say, hey, I'm going to have areas of agreement with almost anyone along the political spectrum. and we're going to be able to work together in order to try to advance policy in those areas of common ground. We have a program that engages senior staffers on Capitol Hill. We call it our Congressional Fellowship Program, and this in itself shows one of the things that is unique about Cato. The staffers who enroll in that program tend to be about, the average is about 60-40 Republicans and Democrats. And usually when you have gatherings on Capitol Hill or near Capitol Hill, being hosted by an organization, it's usually, 100 and 0 or 90 and 10. So we take a lot of pride in that. And one of the things that I say to the congressional fellows is we want to work with all of you. We're going to work with you and your offices and your members of Congress and your senators on different issues depending upon what party you belong to and where you are on the political spectrum, on the philosophical spectrum. But we know that we have things where we want to see policy, going in the same direction.
So I want to talk about the idea of influence. I mean, because you mentioned reaching educators, you mentioned the fellows that you have on Capitol Hill, and I think when we think about influence, we want to drive some sort of action.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the critique of an organization that's very rooted in principles could be, yeah, those are great ideas philosophically, but when it comes to practice, you got to compromise, and so those things may not actually work out as well. So how do you balance the principles with practice and changing policy and shaping culture and all of these things that you do? Love to hear kind of more about how you define that.
The opening to your question was, introducing the idea of, influence and how we exert influence. And I actually think being rooted in principle, being seen as having a high level of integrity and credibility is a very important element in having influence, exerting influence, and ultimately persuading people. Because in order to get things done, you ultimately do need to persuade people. So I think having that reputation for integrity and credibility, in some of the marketing material that we use to introduce people to Cato, there are so many quotes over the years where someone will say, "Hey, I don't always agree with Cato, but I always know what they're telling me is what they really believe. I know they're coming from a principled place." And I think that's, a very important element in having influence, especially in a town where, everything's seen as being, negotiable to one extent or another. You did mention, compromise. I think that one of the things I realize is, having a strong philosophy, I have a very clear view of what I want the world to look like. But I know in any area where we're trying to influence policy, we're not going to jump from where we are today to where I think that we should be. So when change is happening, it's always incremental change. And so the way I try to frame this in our work to make sure that we are still being rooted in principle is to say, when we're exerting, incremental change, we're making incremental change. I always want it to be in the direction of, what I consider the North Star in that particular policy area. And I also don't want to accomplish that incremental change by making or advocating for any compromises of principle that we think we shouldn't be making.
Yeah.
I think that, many people who share, the very liberty focused outlook that we at Cato have, always want to make that big jump, and it's just reality. Change is always going to be incremental, but that doesn't mean that incremental change isn't taking you closer to where you want to be, isn't expanding freedom.
Yeah.
And I think that that's very important to keep in mind. And then also this idea of trying to be friends with everybody. I'm just so tired of angry people, right? I think we all are. And I think that I believe very strongly that one of the ways to persuade people is to be likable. And that doesn't mean, again, that you don't have strong convictions and you work incredibly hard for them. But it means you do so in a way that's civil and respectful and recognizes, our philosophy is very much focused on the individual and the dignity and rights that every individual possesses, as because of that they were given by nature. And if that's your outlook, you really do need to be respectful to others. I think that we all, maybe what we see on the news, the kind of tip of the pyramid in terms of policy making, isn't always very attractive. But, in my personal life, when I'm interacting with people in, let's say, a social setting, um, I just believe everyone's coming from a place of good faith. We all want to live in a world that's prosperous, where people are living meaningful lives in a world, in a country that's at peace. We just all have a different way of getting there, and I think ascribing, evil motives, to people isn't really a good way to meet people where they are. And to your earlier question, meeting people where they are, I think is a big, important element in reaching them and exerting influence.
Yeah, you talk about likability. That old book by Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and
Yes.
Influence People, is a classic, and certainly there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from that. I think there's this interesting challenge when it comes to influence, particularly in a political environment, um, around your principles, and then the practice and when to compromise. I think we can probably all think of, for example, political figures who've been extremely consistent for decades in their positions, and yet they don't have a lot of wins under their belt in terms of that co-sponsored legislation that's passed, for example.
Sure.
They're super principled, but then you look at it and go, well, they're influencing the conversation, but are they influencing the outcomes? And I think the other challenge, and this is one that you probably face a little bit more, is when you find an area of commonality with someone or an organization. Do you ever have folks who say, well, yeah, we agree with them on that, but we're totally at odds with them on this other issue. So should we be really working with them to help them, because this other issue, they just totally are, at odds with us on? And so there's this sort of thing, okay, well, we can be totally consistent and an island and not get things done.
Hmm.
On the other hand, we could work with people where we have common interests, but then sometimes does that put us in another difficult? So these must be the kinds of things that come up in your organization and in your movement.
Sure, but I think it's just self-defeating not to engage, with people, to basically say, "Hey," because we're gonna have disagreement. I focused on the positive, the glass half full, the glass half empty, is we have disagreements,
Yeah.
strong disagreements with everyone. And if we're gonna pick and choose, who are the people we're not going to engage with because we have disagreements with them, as you suggest, we're not going to be getting a lot done. We're not going to be exerting a lot of influence.
I want to hear a little bit more about the education initiative that
Hmm.
you addressed earlier, because from my understanding of other policy research organizations and think tanks, I don't know if there are very many that engage as much with educators and students as you all do. And not only is that something that Cato does, but from my understanding, that's something that you spearheaded when
Hmm.
you came in as the leader. So what led you to decide that, if you care about liberty, you can't just publish ideas for elites in Washington, but you have to, engage teachers and students all across the country? How did that start? And share a little bit more about the evolution of that, because I think that's an interesting facet of influence.
Sure. I'll leave the education program to the side for a minute and just
Okay.
talk a little bit about, what you said at the end about how the world has changed. It used to be that, and I think that you had suggested, when we had a call ahead of this interview, that the way think tanks operate has changed. The way people consume information has changed, and we've had to change along with that, and we want to.
That world where we printed white papers and dropped them off by hand on Capitol Hill, and that was the number one way we tried to get our message out when I worked for an education policy organization early in my career. So yeah, 100%.
Yeah, and I think that model's changed a lot. That was always the classic think tank model, and the reason was, you don't have the resources to reach, the mass audience, to reach everybody in the country the way, let's say, a political campaign does. So what you're focused on, there was a lot of political science research that said, okay, the way public opinion takes its cues from, so-called opinion leaders in the media, in the academy, policymakers. And so what think tanks were trying to do with their finite resources was to try to reach those opinion leaders. And that was one of the ways they influenced policy, and then also could hope to influence public opinion. And I think what's really changed is the way everyone consumes information has changed. The people on Capitol Hill, there are fewer and fewer reading white papers these days. So they're consuming their information differently. So we have to reach them in different ways. But also, I just think about what the technological revolution that we've lived through in our lives has wrought, which is electrons are cheap. And reaching people with electronic information and digitally is just a different, and so reaching a mass audience is a different proposition than it was in years past. So we've really focused on, when I thought about the organization strategically when I arrived, and again, coming from, outside this world, from the corporate sector, I thought about, hey, what should we be doing differently strategically? And I really thought, hey, we should be focusing on distribution a lot more, which is how we get our ideas out there. So we have a greatly expanded outreach effort to Capitol Hill, to the executive branch, to the states than we've had before. But we also have, many more creative people generating, engaging, shareable content that we can distribute through all of the different channels that technology affords us. So that's an evolution that's happened and in some ways a revolution that's happened in the way we operate relative to the way Cato did in decades past. With respect to the education, initiative that you and I have discussed, and this is one where, I think there are numerous think tanks who have tried to do outreach to students, in the past. This is an effort where we're actually doing outreach to teachers. And in the last 5.5 years, we've built a network of over 20,000 teachers, and it feels like we're just getting started. But this is not in order to indoctrinate them in libertarian philosophy or to reach that sliver of libertarian teachers. It's really an effort to try to repair our civic culture. Just because we have, obviously, our mission is, as I said earlier, to try to move policy in the direction of more liberty and also to keep the ideas of liberty alive for future generations. But one of the things I think is also well within our mission is to try to make some contribution to repairing our damaged political culture, to try to make the case for civility and respect and discourse, to try to make a contribution to reducing polarization and repairing that civic culture. Because, if you're making the argument about why liberty will produce the best outcomes for society, and also we make arguments not just on the basis of outcomes, but we think there's a strong moral case to be made for freedom, for human freedom. If you're making that, those arguments, they tend to be nuanced, arguments. You want people to listen. And in an environment where we're all shouting at each other, we feel that our ability to make that case for liberty is reduced. Also, we think we should spend a fair bit of time trying to emphasize, what are the elements of human freedom that are so important that we should all agree on them? Shouldn't we all agree that, freedom of speech, as enshrined in the First Amendment, is very important to all of us, regardless of what your ideology is? Shouldn't we be making the case that the rule of law, which has been so important in preserving freedom and has been so important in the success of the United States over 2.5 centuries. Shouldn't we agree that preserving the rule of law, preventing the undermining of the rule of law is just a shared value and something that we should be working on together? We've really the teachers that have engaged with us and have joined our network are very enthusiastic about this because they see the impact of polarization in their classrooms. They see this extent to which it's impeding their ability to reach students, the degree to which it is creating incivility among students. So it's I view all the things that I've talked about in the context of this program as being very important in advancing a liberty agenda. But I also think they're things that you should care about regardless of where you are philosophically or ideologically.
And say a little bit more about how your programs help to foster that civility in the classroom.
Yeah, we basically have three elements of the program in terms of building the network. We have 2 teacher conferences each summer at Cato, where we bring about 400 teachers from every state here to Cato. We have ongoing online professional development for them nearly every month. And then we have a couple travel teams that this year will visit about 115 cities, visiting schools, districts, engaging at teacher conferences. And that's how we get educators to engage with the program. And we basically provide them professional development training as to how to deal with some of these issues that make things a little bit more challenging in the classroom. And also we provide a lot of classroom content. We have a team of former teachers who know a lot more about lesson plans and what teachers need and how we can assist teachers than I do. And they've been producing substantial amounts of content for which we've seen tremendous uptake on the part of teachers. Again, reinforcing these shared values, trying to make attempts to repair the civic culture, and also figuring out how to tackle contentious issues in the classroom. And obviously, from our perspective, to the extent people recognize respectful disagreement and the importance of viewpoint diversity, we feel that's also an element that is advantageous to us because it allows our point of view to be present in places where sometimes it isn't.
Yeah, when I was in high school, I was big into like all the speech and debate stuff. And certainly there's a benefit to public speaking and confidence and all that. But probably something I didn't realize at the time that I realized later was just practicing taking a position and being passionate about your idea and being able to have that open but civil disagreement and then, move on and, go to the next thing or go back to being friends is so important. And I think that's, an
Yes.
important lesson in influence, isn't it? Is, just having to go through that exercise.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And particularly in the context of debate in schools, often you have to take a position that you don't believe in.
Right.
Just to be able to understand that position and to argue things from that point of view. It always, I think, gives you a greater appreciation for the point of view of others, and also creates an advantage. It's beneficial for you because you understand how to make your case in a more compelling way.
This episode is brought to you by the George Washington University's College of Professional Studies. With in-person and online programs ranging from master's degrees in public relations strategy to certificate programs in digital communications, GW offers more than just the credentials to help working professionals get ahead. It prepares them to be leaders in their field. Check out cps.gwu.edu for more information. A lot of folks in Washington and graduates from the GW Graduate School of Political Management and the College of Professional Studies, which are our great partners and Chief Influencer, they're in organizations where they're trying to figure out, how do I get my message outside of the Beltway? How do I get my message out across America? And you shared one of the ways that you all do that through your education initiatives. You're bringing teachers here. You have these teams going out to over 100 cities. So there's this physical element of what we can do. There's this content, but of course, as you also mentioned, technology has changed, and social media is a way to get out there. And I just happened to be scrolling through Instagram not too long ago, and in my feed popped I'll call it a viral moment from testimony with Senator Kennedy on Capitol Hill, and it happened to be one of your team members from Cato.
I think I know the clip to which you're referring.
I bet you do, because it I think had millions of people have seen this clip, and
Yes.
there's not too many think tank clips that get picked up.
You said, quote, "They," referring to Republicans, "think they can troll their way into us accepting ethnic cleansing," end quote. Your words, not mine. Did I read that correctly?
That was in regard to a
Did I
Department of
read that?
Homeland
Did I
Security
read
post
that?
about advocating 100 million deportations. That is what DHS had own account. 100 million deportations
hurts, doesn't
would be ethnic cleansing. You would be
Truth hurts,
removing
doesn't it?
1/3 of the country. So yes, there
Truth
are
can
people
just
within the
gut you like
Department
a
of
fish.
Homeland
And
Security.
you don't think this is hyperbolic? Give me 30 more seconds.
I think advocating 100 million deportations is
I'm having fun here, Mr.
ethnic
Chairman.
cleansing.
Maybe you could say something about that. I mean, I don't know if these things are, planned, if it was a surprise. What do you have to do to sort of get your team members to be able to be out there in the world to do that? But certainly that's a way that you broke outside of the Beltway, because a lot of people who were commenting and who saw that, they're not in Washington. They don't necessarily work on the Hill. And, again, it's not too often we see like a C-SPAN clip that gets that sort of play. So
Yes.
what were you happy when you saw that?
Well, I can say it wasn't intentional, because it's really hard to plan something like that. In fact, if you do show the clip, I think what people will see is that, Senator Kennedy seems to be one of the masters of the gotcha, and he was actually, and I think this is probably one of the things that contributed to this clip going viral, is that he was kind of laying a trap for, our immigration expert, David Beer, who holds the Sells Foundation Chair in Immigration Policy at Cato. And I think it kind of backfired on the senator. And David was respectful, but he was basically making his argument and refused to accept the argument that the senator was making, that some of his statements were hyperbolic. And so we didn't plan that, but it is an example of why external engagement is so important. As I mentioned, external engagement, whether it's, sharing digital content through technology, or meetings with staff or members of Congress on the Hill, or testifying to Congress. These are all things that Cato's doing much more of than it has in the past. And I'm really proud of David, because it shows the level of preparation, the level of knowledge and expertise and poise of our policy experts. And it was really, again, not a planned moment, but it was only able to be, successful from the perspective of, putting, I think, showing David in a very positive light, and going viral because of all those factors that are strengths that, we're really looking for in all of our people.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, it wasn't planned, but he was prepared, which is what allowed it to happen. I mean, I know what I
Yes.
saw, and I thought, man, he is good, because, I've never had to testify before Congress and be on the hot seat in a way like that. But, sometimes, somebody says something and then like an hour later you think of the comeback or whatever. I mean, he was just in the moment able to very confidently
Yes.
respond. And I thought it was just an interesting example. And I thought, wow, Cato is really getting their message out there with this guy, because I was kind of shocked to just happen across it. I don't think the algorithm showed it to me because you and I were planning to do this interview. I think it was just something that was really viral at the moment.
Yes, I think that's right. I think that's right. And also, I think it shows, again, I think the passion that you saw David exhibiting there shows the again, being rooted in principle, and being moored in that way, I think gives you strengths. And I guess, as I was saying earlier, it makes you more persuasive, allows you to exert more influence because you have that credibility, and you really are rooted in the values that we for which we advocate.
I think we're going to end up circling back a little bit to the sort of social media approach that you and the organization take by me asking you this question, which is that, you came to Cato from the private sector, from Wall Street.
Mhm.
You were focused on financial services. You were not a scholar, that was kind of positioning yourself to lead an organization like this, as many people who might pursue a different scholarly track do. How has that background shaped the way that you lead as the CEO of Cato?
I would describe it, and this isn't maybe completely accurate, but I would describe myself as more of a Mr. Inside than a Mr. Outside, which is I feel that we have, a policy staff that's outstanding. And I view those folks as really being the stars of our organization. And they should be out there advocating, telling the story, making the case. My role, I think, is developing strategy, making sure the organization has the resources it needs to execute on its mission as effectively as possible. Actually, both those things, strategy and resources, are very important to effective execution, of the mission. And then making sure that the organization is, operating well internally. We like to run a tight ship from the perspective of expenses. We like to have very strong internal accountabilities for personal performance, for having a strategy of how your work is going to help create the change that we seek or fulfill our mission. And so I see my role. I think if I had come up the way most think tank presidents do as a scholar, I'd have my own research presence, my own external presence. And I didn't think it was necessarily efficient for me to prioritize building that over figuring out the things that I could do as a leader to make the organization more effective. One of the things you asked about when we first got together and we're talking about the show is the fact that I don't have a presence on social media. I would love to have 200,000 Twitter followers, X followers, that would give me a platform that I don't have now. And there are times when I feel so strongly about something I'm seeing in the world, I wish I was able to communicate it externally in a very forceful way. But when I joined Cato, it was really just a question of trade-off and opportunity cost. What it would have taken, the time I'd have to dedicate to building a social media presence that would be effective, really would have taken me away from a lot of other things that I think were more important, were higher priorities. And that's a message that I really communicate internally, often, which is, and anyone who's listening, and you as well, Anthony, would know that every day when you get in and you go to work, there are probably 50 things you could be doing. Well, you have time to do 2 or 3 of them.
Yeah.
Why do you pick the 2 or 3 that you've chosen to execute that day, compared to the dozens of others? And those choices, that prioritization, is so important in making anyone an effective professional. And that was that's something I challenge our people on all the time. Why are you doing what you're doing? And how is that going to contribute to execution of our mission?
Yeah.
And I hold myself to the same standard. And if I were on the treadmill of figuring out, what I was going to post that day, I think it would take me away from other things I've been able to do that have helped make the organization stronger and make us more effective executing on the mission. And I probably sound like a broken record when I say execute on the mission, but there's a special responsibility that comes when you're running an institution that's funded by voluntary contributions. And most of our contributions come from individuals. You have an unbelievable responsibility to these people to make sure that you are getting the most out of the resources they're entrusting to you, having the most impact you can, and executing effectively on the stated mission of the organization. And all the things that we've been talking about are an important element of that.
And I love your candor on that, saying, well, yeah, I wish I had hundreds of thousands of followers, but hey, that hasn't been the big priority. The
Yes.
priority has been a lot of the internal stuff, and also, empowering other team members to do that. In fact, if I remember right, I think you may have told me that when you were on Wall Street, you had a manager that kind of gave you some advice about shifting from being
Mhm.
a producer. Am I remembering that right? Can you tell us that?
Yeah. He wasn't a director of the organization, but he was kind of like that. He was a mentor to many of us. And you get you get to a point in your career on Wall Street where you're largely a producer, working with clients, executing deals, but then you're becoming more senior. And at some point, many people have the opportunity to cross over and become a manager and a leader. And for a lot of us, it was difficult to give up that primary client responsibility and responsibility for winning and executing, financing transactions. And what he said to me was, look, think of what you could be contributing to the organization if taking time away from doing your own deals, you were able to make 25 people in the organization better. And that was pretty good advice. And I think that's probably informed what I described as, how I see my role at Cato and how I've chosen, to prioritize the things that I do. The fact that I'm a think tank president, I guess that's not on social media, is probably unusual. Although as you pointed out, I followed an unusual path to get here. But I was also unusual when I was on Wall Street. I was an investment banker who didn't know how to play golf. And playing golf with your clients was always the classic, kind of banker thing. And it was the same thing. Well, what's the time I'm going to have to invest in becoming, a golfer where I'm not embarrassing myself in front of my clients, and what's that going to take away from? What are the other things how I could be using that time and effort? And in fact, I see a parallel between my time, as a banker and not playing golf, and now as the leader of Cato, which is, to me, it's the power of the ideas. I worked at banks where we're always trying to break in against established competitors and build a franchise. And I said, hey, you have to do that by having better ideas and better execution. And that's how I see what we're trying to do at Cato. I think that we, maintaining adherence to our philosophy is part of maintaining that integrity and differentiating yourself, and also bringing a commitment to excellence in your work and trying to bring the best ideas you can to the table, and how to make people's lives better, freer, more prosperous, more peaceful.
What I love about some of these answers, I mean, the word authenticity comes up a lot. And we had one guest, Lydia Soto Harmon from the Student Conservation Association, said, she doesn't really, that word just kind of it's so overused now. She said, let's just talk about being real, being who you are. And, but I think so whatever vocabulary we use, there's something about like being who you are. And, you could be a successful investment banker without having to be a golfer. That might
Yes.
be somebody else's thing. Doesn't have to be your thing. And you can look at it and go, wow, every successful investment banker is a golfer, but that obviously isn't true. And you show that. And you can also be a successful leader of a think tank or a policy, research organization, and not necessarily be very big on social media. You do have to make sure your organization has a way to reach people where they are.
Absolutely.
And that can be from your brand. That can be from you. That can be from your people. And after you and I had our prep call, because, we talked about preparation. So like I always, every time I can, meet with a guest before this, because I just always want to learn and understand what we're going to focus on. And one of the things that you and I talked about around that, and then I went and I had a conversation with a colleague, and I said, what's so interesting? I've interviewed several leaders who have said, because I have built my brand on social media, my team members have followed my example, and it's helped us expand our reach. But then I talked to you and I went, here's a leader who has not built his brand on social media. And yet we have David Beer going viral, and we have many people at your organization who've grown their own followings, and of course the brand has. And both of those things can be true, right?
Absolutely.
What it comes
Absolutely.
down to is what authentically works for you as a leader, and what is the approach to make sure that you meet people where they are. Many of those other organizations, maybe whose folks have built up on social media, they don't have 20,000 teachers as part of their network. And so, the importance of knowing what's authentic to us, what's us being real, what works for us, and focusing on those things rather than spreading ourselves too thin and trying to do everything and trying to, frankly, get the FOMO, the fear of missing out, and copy what everybody else is doing. That's one of the things I've learned from you and so many of the chief influencers. It's like, hey, what are my goals? What's going to work for me? And let me just take steps one at a
Yes.
time toward that.
Plus, we're all just a different portfolio of talents and skills and strengths and weaknesses and areas for improvement. So the right formula for one person is never going to be the right formula for another person. You really do have to think about, what are you good at, and how do you bring that to the organization to create the most value to the organization? One of the things we talk a lot about internally is, where do we find people's, how do we figure out what people's kind of highest and best use is, where they can make the greatest contribution, to the organization and its mission. And that's not always obvious. And sometimes it takes trial and error. And sometimes you end up moving people around into different, positions as you figure that out. Or you make mistakes when you expand the responsibility of some people and you realize, hey, this really isn't what they're good at. They really weren't up for these additional responsibilities. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind, because if you're, putting someone in a role or, following the formula that requires a skill that you don't have, that's suboptimal.
And Peter, as I made my argument there and you just reinforced it, you just pulled it back into this idea of individual liberty to reinforce exactly what
Right.
organization stands for, right? Which is like that, everybody has different skills. We have to bring those together. So well done. That's very good influence strategy there. So I'm nodding along going, oh, yeah, I get what he's talking about. I always love closing by asking our guests, they always have just such fascinating career paths and the work that they do. And you, in particular, you've gone from Wall Street to now, leading Cato, which is this, very well-known organization. How has your view of influence evolved across your career to where you are now? I mean, how would you define influence now? And how's that maybe different from how you would have looked at it earlier in your career?
I would say that what stands out to me is not necessarily how it's evolved, but how it stayed the same. And I think one element of that is, trying to have better ideas, or, just trying to, when you're competing, trying to be better, whether it's better people or better ideas or better execution. I think that's very important. And integrity, principles, values. It's not just true at Cato. It was true on Wall Street. It maybe wasn't as important an element of influence, on Wall Street as it is for us at Cato, but it was still very important to have that. In fact, I've told my kids many times over the years that feeling good about who you are and liking what you see when you look in the mirror is just super important. And I think that it becomes even more important as you get older, and it becomes more important to you. So that's a lesson that I've tried to impart on them, and I think it's an important ingredient of success as well. Maybe when I tried to draw a distinction there of how important kind of integrity was on Wall Street as influence versus Cato, maybe that wasn't right, because maybe, being trusted is,
Sure.
Really important in almost anything that you do. And that directly, feeds into integrity, character, principles.
I think that when I think about this conversation we had today, Peter, and I'm so grateful that you took time to be with us, principled influence is sort of the theme that I come away with. you definitely throughout have stayed consistent with this idea of holding true to principles as a way to, as you just said it, build trust and exert that influence. And as political parties move around, as technology changes and tactics, evolve, there are a lot of things that change and where we have to change. And we heard how you've done that in your organization through technology, through launching an education initiative, working directly with teachers, for example. But being consistent with your principles is a really great way to establish influence with others because they know where you stand. They know where it's not going to change. Like you said, some of your supporters have said, we may not agree with every single thing, but we know that you're going to stick to those principles. And I think that's a really important thing for all of us to think about during a time when it's very tempting to jump onto the new thing and change, positions on something and try to compromise. And it's not black or white is what I have taken away from this. You can stay true to your principles and find ways to partner with others and find ways to compromise so that you can have an incremental win toward the direction that you're going. And, win friends and influence people. You talked about, being friendly and building those relationships. And I also just think a great way to, take away from this conversation is how, you were the investment banker who didn't golf and that worked great for you. And as a leader, you haven't really focused on building your own brand on social media, but by doing that, many others on your team have. And certainly we have the fun clip of David Beer going head to head with a senator and how Cato's getting its message out in that way. So many lessons in leadership, many lessons in influence from our conversation today, but with a focus on principled influence. Peter, thank you so much for taking time to be with us.
Anthony, really grateful for you having me and completely enjoyed the conversation.
Likewise. Chief Influencer is a production of Social Driver. We help clients transform complexity into clarity with people-centered strategies. Whether you're looking to elevate the influence of your brand or of your leaders, check out socialdriver.com to learn more. For show notes or to nominate a guest, visit us at chiefinfluencer.org or follow Chief Influencer on LinkedIn.